Greetings, my beautiful friends. Let's talk about the traffic light. In psychology, biology, science fiction, Tibetan Buddhism, history, and in contemporary art, all to better understand what is going on with this other than human character in Twin Peaks. The Twin Peaks traffic light. It's iconic. It shows up twice in the pilot, all throughout seasons 1 and 2 and the film, and now it echoes beautifully throughout the return, from one end to another. For example, the different colored Rancho Rosa intros look like traffic lights, and there is clearly a yellow light for part 3, which is when we get Dougie, a red light for part 9, and a green light for part 16 when we get Cooper back and can finally go. The signal stretches and refracts in other ways too, like how in part 5, a green light flashes onto Anthony's face. And if you blur your eyes, the evolution of the arm kind of looks like a traffic light, especially when it's yelling, "Go now, go now," from atop its tree in part 2. And isn't its doppelganger yellow? Also, a woodsman looks like a traffic light in the floral wallpaper room in part 15 when he moves from one position to another to let Mr. C go through to the Dutchman's. He's directing traffic, and in this sense, oh my goodness, Bobby Briggs in part 11, also a traffic light. He's the receiving end of that woman screaming from her car to let her go through. And this reminds me of another one of my favorite scenes from The Return in part 2, a scene that one critic called a great echo of the original stoplight scene turned into a rattling, noisy hell beast. It's that scene when we wait and wait at that train crossing light, and we can hear the train screaming in our ears long before we ever see it. Is this a metaphor for the show itself? It's not until part 6 of The Return that the original stoplight from the pilot properly returns, and there's this holy shit moment, and it changes from yellow to red, and then in the next scene when Cooper is working on his case files, his yellow pencil turns red, probably due to a continuity error. And thank you, Redditors Gail Vico and I Am Dead Yet I Live for that one. In art, we honor errors as hidden intentions, and I wonder if Dwayne Dunham, for fun, edited in the traffic light at the beginning of that scene in order to draw attention to the error. Tangentially, Richard Horne's car is both red and green, which has got to mean something, and John Bernardi thinks it suggests the story is going through him, Richard. Finally, in Laura Palmer and Carrie Page's house in part 18, an isolated picture on the wall looks like the traffic light, and just in case we weren't paying attention, right beneath it are 3 stacks of toilet paper, 3 TPs. Laura and Bobby used to call Twin Peaks TP in the diary. This all seems very deliberate, especially considering we see all our favorite Twin Peaks symbols in and around this woman's house in Odessa. Number 6 telephone pole is right outside. In the pilot, the traffic light appears next to its cousin, the ceiling fan, another signal from above. This one telling Leland, you can go in now. At the beginning of season 2, when Cooper lays it all out at the sheriff's station, it's superimposed over images of donuts. Ooh, yum. And a few episodes later, it fades into Maddie's head when she's looking at Laura's homecoming picture and talking with Leland, and I think this foreshadows her death. I'm getting these still shots from Stephen Miller setting the stage. Miller points out that one of the reasons the light is emblematic of the show, like the homecoming picture, coffee and donuts, is because it appeared on promotional materials and VHS cases in the 1990s, and hell, if I didn't know any better, just looking at these cases, I'd assume it was the star of the show. It's also hanging out at the beginning of the original 1988 script. Greg Olson in Beautiful Dark says that it was Frost who came up with the traffic light scenes in the pilot, probably as a nod to Lynch's use of them in Blue Velvet, which was a nod to somebody else. Why exactly do Lynch and Frost like the image so much? I think it could have something to do with the children's game, Red Light, Green Light, also known as statues. It's been around for over 100 years. It's everywhere. It's foundational, fundamental. And as philosopher Roland Barthes famously points out, children's games prefigure the world. And both Lynch and Frost had a lot of experience with this game, and also probably with a milk drinking game called Red Light, Green Light that was featured on the TV show Cartoon Express that ran from 1954 to 1966. And its creator and host, engineer Bill William Stula, won 2 Emmy Awards for this thing. Kids at home, they could compete and win against the host on TV. It was so interactive. Interestingly, he's pictured often with a clock and with a clown. The point is that traffic lights historically extend beyond the street. They even reach into the bomb. Legend has it, Leo Szilard, the mind behind the bomb, got his idea for a nuclear reactor by watching a traffic light turn from red to green. And this is also when he says he saw time crack open. Szillard's nuclear reactor does kind of look like a traffic light and a cherry pie. Hold up, did the light facilitate some kind of revelation for Szilard? Did traffic lights help give birth to the bomb? They're within us too. Neurobiologists insist there's a traffic light in the brain and a traffic light approach to understanding the brain. Of course, our traffic light brains manufactured traffic lights. Our eyes also have 3 cones that can pick up 3 colored wavelengths, red, green, and blue, which is apparently one of the reasons the traffic light uses 3 colors. Red is the longest wavelength and can be seen the farthest away, so this gives trains and later cars more time to stop on foggy nights. We also use traffic light metaphors. They're metaphors we live by in film production, sports, sexual harassment, eating, dieting, and childhood sexuality. They're influencing how we think about a lot of things. And when we sit with them, they induce boredom, which actually has its own psychological and physical benefits. And weirdly, red lights induce scratching. According to psychodermatology and what's called the traffic light phenomenon, they also kill people. The very first one exploded and killed the police officer who was operating it. And when the automated ones that we all know and love were first invented and installed in US cities in the early 1920s, people were actually a little scared of them. They thought they were dangerous, even evil, for a number of reasons. First, people were still dying beneath them. They didn't really solve the problem. And also, they had an impact on civility. And I'm getting this from Megan Kate Nelson's brief history of the stoplight. Drivers didn't have to acknowledge other people at intersections anymore. The stoplight decided everything, and so the once daily public experience of connecting with other human beings, making eye contact, negotiating, this turned into just another private moment to sit alone, lost in thought. They're antisocial and encourage isolation and alienation, and these machines also quickly became what Bruno Latour and Michel Serres call quasi-objects, and what Timothy Morton calls world-encircling hyper-objects, and what William Irwin Thompson calls the next alphas, enunciating the next level of order, which is one definition of evil, the enunciation of the next level of order. Marshall McLuhan would say that they're examples of a tool we shaped that now shapes us. Nelson writes that the traffic light shaped our cities and sparked our love affair with the car itself. So in a sense, traffic lights are extensions of our brains, our cars, our hearts, our eyes with their cameras, insurance agencies. Every extension requires an amputation, as McLuhan says, or every new technology requires a sacrifice. And so we gotta wonder, what do we lose? What do we give up? I think it's clear that these American machines, these panoptic light machines installed all over the world, keep everyone in control. They choreograph dangerous sights from above, and they partake in making both more dangerous. After they were installed in the 20s, drivers became more anxious, and it became apparent that the lights produced an increase in road rage. And I'm getting this from a Phenomenology of Traffic in Ho Chi Minh City by Glenn Wyatt. And we know how they felt. We feel it too. People get frustrated when they have to wait at red lights, and so naturally, yellow and green lights begin to encourage speed. And this makes accidents more fatal. So it makes sense why some critics would dub these new devices that encourage speed the most destructive machines yet to be devised by man. And it's true that in what we now call the United States, about 20% of accidents occur at these things. Nearly 165,000 accidents happen every year from people running red lights. 1,000 people a year die in the United States from red light running. Are the lights partially to blame? If they're alphas, they're predators. Michael Garfield explains that we humans are haunted by all the predators that used to hunt us. Now they haunt us from inside of modern life. And it's not just a coincidence that road rage and speeding cars and car accidents are all recurring motifs in horror films, especially David Lynch's horror films. Twin Peaks scholar Jeffrey Weinstock calls them demonic objects, and they're viewed next to the owls and swaying branches, like they're witnesses to the crime. They all saw something that night. It's spooky, but the final shot of the traffic light in the pilot is sandwiched between a shot of the log on the beach where Laura's body was found, the ceiling fan, and Sarah Palmer on the couch. What we let into our lives? What's in our house now? Emerson warned us that when we discard our angels, archangels take their place. And I find it interesting that to combat the invading traffic light technology, some neighborhoods are retrieving what's called shared spaces. Places where the sidewalk doesn't end. Open roundabouts where everyone, drivers, pedestrians, cyclists, they can all safely coexist. And these angelic spaces are proving that the absence of traffic signs makes everyone more cautious. Maybe we should all revert to what's called magical roundabouts. It turns out that the same increase in caution happens whenever the power goes out. Ooh, like in part 18. People slow down, look alive, fewer people die. And it doesn't really slow down traffic all that much. Okay, so interesting fact, there is no traffic light at the Twin Peaks filming location for Sparkwood in 21, which means it was added to the scene on purpose. Hopefully I won't irritate you if we move on from traffic light history to traffic light art. I think something happens when an elusive world-encircling hyperobject, which is usually pushed into the background ubiquity, gets moved into the spotlight. A new gestalt forms or something. Generally, whenever we turn parts of our environment into art, we reframe ourselves and shift into a deeper perspective that philosophers like to call decentered consciousness, which just means that we can become sensitive to new environments and can catch new ideas. Again, it's what Marshall McLuhan says, the previous environment becomes a work of art in the new invisible environment. Or the subject of one stage of consciousness becomes the object for the subject of the next stage. And we can approach stoplights as ready-made art objects or strange tools, or due to the inevitable rise of self-driving car technology, they're soon to be negated yet preserved hyperart Thomasons. And thank you, Eli Fair, for that one. Hyperart Thomasons, which is to say, they're going to be treated like potted plants. Anyway, when we approach everyday things as art, or just as complex magical entities, in and of themselves, it's easy to flip our perspective, to decenter the human, and see, in quotations, material agency, actor networks, and buildings breathe people through pathways regulated by the traffic lights. This alien eye view is captured so beautifully here by Ron Frick in his 1992 film, Baraka. And I also like the work of artist-geographer Bill Passaris, who remarks on the practical and poetic levels of a traffic light that invite us to see it as part of a larger art installation. And another artist who can help us see whole traffic light environments is Hans Optebeek, who builds tiny installations like this one called Location 1, where we walk into the gallery, turn the corner, and are confronted with a dark, foggy intersection. Due to the shift in scale, we're positioned in a bird's eye view, slightly above traffic light level. Inside is now outside. The exact edges of the artwork disappear in foggy darkness. Silent stillness surrounds the only activity, the switching on and off of traffic lights. They pulsate. The whole thing feels allegorical and sacred, like a painting. This helps me appreciate how in Twin Peaks, there's also a figure ground reversal as the tiny lights draw attention to the empty space around them. It's like a moving painting. And J.P. Tellett, in his 1995 essay, The Disorder of Things in Twin Peaks, uses Foucault's idea of blank spaces and surveillance to better understand what the traffic light is doing in the show and in us. William Irwin Thompson talks more generally about the mind being like a flashlight in search of darkness, which is all around. And the more it searches, the more it chases it away. And if we want to see the nature of what's going on, we have to shift from a creative mode to a receptive mode. We have to turn off the mind and allow the darkness to communicate with us. Another work of art that can help us understand the significance of the traffic light, especially in America and in the rest of the colonized world, is Ojibwe artist Carl Beam's 1992 painting Columbus Chronicles. 1992. It was a big year for indigenous art all over the world, as it was the Columbian quincentenary. And I feel like Twin Peaks is actually a footnote to this painting. In the upper left corner, the word Hiroshima is stenciled in white letters over a famous image of Hiroshima City after the bombing. And in the opposite corner, the bottom right, we see a traffic light with the red light on. Between them in the center is what looks like a $5 bill, so Abraham Lincoln, but no, it's not him. It's Running Antelope, Hunkpapa Lakota Chief, Running Antelope on the 1899 $5 silver note. Another artist who elevates traffic light imagery is Edgar Negrit. In fact, most of his sculptures are remixed versions. He calls them magical machines, masks, or here a kachina. I wonder if Negrit, who also calls them miracles, and recalls seeing a traffic light for the very first time when visiting New York City from Colombia, and compares it to a Greek god, I wonder if he's suggesting that traffic lights are comparable to Native American meta-persons. Pasaris also calls traffic lights the frozen incarnation of Hermes' god, messengers and indicators of the transient. Can we see Twin Peaks in a similar way? As frozen incarnations of a god, or as messengers and indicators of the transient? Why does the traffic light inspire such big ideas in all these different disciplines? Pasaris explains that due to their design, the light naturally becomes poetic links for the intellectual mind, triggers of the unnoticed beauty, semicolons bounded to place, but rites of passage for the next to happen. They're featured in this eerie installation by George Siegel, who often creates artificial hells of people waiting at traffic signals. Traffic lights are in some other work too, like the traffic light tree in London or in Lothar Hempel installations, but I don't think any work of art imbues them with as much mystery and significance as Twin Peaks. I want to consider them as Dadaist art objects, strange tools, but also as sacred sites, not only because they represent important places in the show, but also because there's a saying that in small towns they never put up a stoplight until someone gets killed. And if this is true, then stoplights are roadside memorials. And again, Twin Peaks is foregrounding what's missing, or who's missing, or that there's something missing. Then again, these expensive machines are installed in small towns regardless of need all the time, because of another saying that it's embarrassing to be a one stoplight town. So in a sense, they're symbols of the unnecessary. They're probably unnecessary in Twin Peaks. Always signaling, floating above us like planets, apertures, eyeballs, oculi. Cooper in part 2 opens the curtains of the Red Room and sees a highway from the perspective of a traffic light. Are these devices how the aliens peek in on us? We know that one of their lodge worlds is right above ours. For fun, my theory is that the traffic light, the one from the pilot that transitions into Eileen Hayward's wheelchair, is a person, like the log or the ring. It's a person, all right. Or it's where someone lives, like Philip Jeffries. It could also be an extension of someone, and if this is the case, then it's probably the arm. Go now. The arm seems to be able to travel through electricity. The number 6 telephone pole could be its gateway. It dressed in red, and it controls how people get in and out of the Red Room. It's a gatekeeper. Ooh, interestingly, the pole that supports the real traffic light head or signal stack is called the arm, and they used to be controlled manually. Maybe it's what the electrician's been doing, an old school policeman wizard who extends into the lights through his cane, and his job, that was decided at the meeting above the convenience store, is to control the traffic lights. He looks up and says, "Animal life." Who knows, maybe whoever controls the lights controls the town, controls the game, controls who runs into whom. I'm probably thinking this because hacking traffic lights is one of my favorite television tropes. It's usually used in shows to show off someone's skills. Think about Mr. C hacking the prison. And I think some people claim that their bodies affect the lights and they experience streetlight interference phenomenon, or what's known as high voltage syndrome. We do have a subtle bioelectric charge and maybe even a sense of being stared at, but I think perceiving or just dreaming of this ability relates to our experience with the buttons installed at intersections that actually do give us this power, or appear to. Most of them don't work anymore, and are placebo buttons, more hyper automatons. Even though they don't work, they work by giving us the illusion of control. What I'm trying to say is that the traffic light in Twin Peaks is framed to suggest it's a character in the show, involved in the plot. Lynch and Frost, they don't have to tell us the whole story. They introduce a panoply of interesting characters, some of them other than human, line them up in the imagination, suggest certain relationships and rules, and then let us take it from there. It's a receptive and creative experience, like a game, like a dream. And there's a way that traffic lights are, that the traffic light is a person, place, and thing, and sacred site, and maybe somebody else too. I like to think that it's somebody else. But a popular fan theory, and it's a good one, is that the lights are all part of Laura's elaborate dream world, and for some reason it's burned into her bardo as a blue key is burned into Diane Selwyn's bardo. An ominous machine hanging there, lynched. It is about the size of a small person. It's seared into her mind, maybe because it was a beacon whenever she snuck out of the house to meet Leo and Jacques for sex, and according to the secret diary, she did this a lot. Or maybe it's there because it was the last sign of life that she saw before she died or disappeared. And it could also foreshadow part 18, the end, back to starting positions, back to red. It could also suggest Laura's paranoid, that the lights are watching her like the owls, and you know what, they probably are. It's also likely that Laura identifies with them, or that the traffic light is a color or pattern that Lynch is using to paint her portrait. Metaphorically, but is Twin Peaks, so who knows? A part of Laura is trapped in the traffic light, and Fred from TwinPeaksGazette.com describes this idea beautifully. He says, quote, "The stoplight is all alone, and it carries on going through the motions even when there are no people around. Perhaps this reflects Laura's loneliness and her feeling obliged to go through the motions. I think what we do as fans is deep map Twin Peaks, to use William Heatman's phrase. And we rotate this deep map in our imagination to look at it through or from different angles. And we do this to find out what happens when we begin to think about Laura Palmer through the lens of a traffic light. What happens when we think about the entire series through this lens, or ourselves through the lens of a traffic light? The light becomes, like any Lynchian quasi-object, or like any work of art, a framework that brings certain aspects of ourselves and the show into greater focus. And it makes me think of something that the great Lu Ming says. Often, one idea is presented visually in multiple ways. There are layers of abstraction. And if the stoplight represents the character of the show itself, then Twin Peaks gives us some green and yellow lights, but mostly red lights. It makes us wait. It wants us to wait. And the pace of the show, probably the pace of any good show, resembles the pace of a drive. There's some backing up, accelerating, slowing down, stopping, waiting, starting back up again, and there's some letting go. The lights are a signal for a type of consciousness, or awareness, or experience, which is just another word for awareness. And essentially, within the millions of cyclopean stoplights floating above our heads, we've got three conditions in a loop. There are three lights, three bodies, as there are three Coopers, three Phillips, each assigned to a Cooper, three Lauras, three seasons, three Bobs, according to the evolution of the arm. Also within the return, we begin and end more or less in the same place. So too, as the Buddhists would say, every 24 hours we humans experience three major states of consciousness in a loop: waking, dreaming, and sleeping. Three great states, available to everyone, even babies. You're mostly in just one at a time. In this case, the waking state, with the others pushed just right into the background, but they're still there, as are their signature brainwave patterns. Can you see them? Can you feel them back there? As William James put it 100 years ago, our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness. while all around it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, are other kinds of consciousness. And at night, we fall out of our waking state and start orbiting around the dreaming and sleeping states, with now waking consciousness waiting just outside the horizon. Chaos mathematician Alan Combs thinks states of consciousness should be conceptualized as chaotic attractors, a math term, because whenever we change states, when we fall asleep, or rather the sleep state begins to overtake us, we drift off as if carried away towards a new attractor basin. However it happens, the Buddhists point out that falling asleep is also waking up to these more subtle states of consciousness. And I hope I don't bother you if I indulge, but Cooper is a Tibetan dream yogi, and in that system, each of these three great states of consciousness correspond with a dream world or realm. So waking, dreaming, and sleeping states correlate with gross, subtle, and causal realms. And Eastern philosophers also point out that this spectrum of consciousness is supported by a spectrum of energy that runs from gross physical energy, which is the heaviest, to subtle or etheric mental psychic energy, to causal energy. These energies also are known as bodies or sheaths, because every mind has a body, and every body-mind co-enacts a realm. Therefore, like Dale Cooper, we all have 3 minds, 3 bodies, and 3 realms. I'm a whole damn town. Next to all these, there's a popular Tibetan Buddhist practice called Om Ahum, which imagines the 3 bodies and energies as 3 colors and sounds stacked on top of each other, going on and off like a traffic light. I posted instructions to this Tibetan traffic light meditation that Cooper probably practices to 25 years later if you're interested, and there you'll find links and citations and more notes. But just a quick warning, according to the teachers, these Maha Mantras, the Om, Ah, and Hum, summon very refined impulses of creative intelligence, sometimes referred to as angels and devas, so look out. Also, if you take the time to imagine tiny versions of your favorite meta persons or entities floating inside your body as the sources of the lights and mantras, they're more likely going to show up and their qualities are more likely going to manifest, evidently. I should also mention that in the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition, this particular stoplight meditation provides preparation for the realization at the time of death. And I posted more about that on 25 years later too. So, the traffic light. It's not simply a location in space, it's also a vehicle in time that can accelerate the evolution of consciousness. Maybe even set us face to face with the clear light, like Dale Cooper does for Leland Palmer in season 2. And every day, that boring minute waiting at a stoplight becomes a moment for watching the eye get lost in dreams. A phase space. They seem to hold a mystical, almost koan-like potential when considered in this way. They're openings, and they reflect qualities of the human condition, qualities that include glowing totemic signal stacks turning on and off. Okay, my conclusions. These manufactured entities are alive and in control. They influence all kinds of non-driving behavior. They even co-founded the Manhattan Project, holy shit, and they're part of a team of meta-persons meeting behind the curtains, conjuring the features of our world. Also, enough people have died, lives ruined, and property damaged that traffic lights are comparable to bombs and demons. We can also see how traffic lights are a positive way into a decentered consciousness and a post-human, hyper-object actor network mindset that's decolonizing. Because turning objects into people is the opposite of what colonialism does. And they're also good containers for visualizing season 3 as a whole, and they help us think about an ever-changing 3-tiered signal stack of dream states happening inside all of us all the time. Finally, like any good religious text, Twin Peaks is itself a stoplight, a space and time for probing and synthesizing, waiting and accelerating, an eternal stoplight. And it also asked that we consider these inert objects as significant actors, and that we take inventory of all the dead things in our world too, because they have special agency. Maybe the most obvious example of this is a traffic light, something that literally directs people, like a film director. All right, thank you all so much for your attention. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the traffic light, or anything related. Let's think out loud. Please post a comment, and remember, you're dreaming.